Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? For those of you who don't know, my name is Adam Stolberg, and I'm the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And on behalf of my colleagues, the staff, and the students of the school, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to join us today with this fireside chat with General Stanley McChrystal. Before introducing our guests, I would like to do several things. First, I'd like to thank the Bankoff family for the very generous gift that has allowed us to hold such events on global leadership. I want to thank our partners in Global Atlanta for helping to promote the event across Atlanta and the Southeast region. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you today, and especially Eric Koob, our administrative assistant here, who's really put this together. As I mentioned, I'd really like to welcome you today for what stands to be a very timely and illuminating conversation with General McChrystal. For those of you who don't know, General McChrystal is a retired four-star general from the U.S. Army. Throughout his career, he commanded the International Security Assistance Forces in Afghanistan. He directed the Joint Special Operations Command and also was the director of the Joint Staff. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates once described General McChrystal as perhaps the finest warrior and leader of men in combat that he ever met. Upon retirement from the Army, General McChrystal founded the McChrystal Group that delivers innovative leadership solutions to businesses worldwide. He's also taught at Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and he is a well-known author of 5 books, several of which are New York Times bestsellers, including the most recent On Character. He is here today to discuss that latest work and the link between character, public service, and leadership. General McChrystal's interlocutor today in the fireside chat is the Honorable John Tien. For the sake of brevity, John served as the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. He was previously a managing director at Citibank and retired from the U.S. Army at the rank of colonel. John commanded a combat task force in Iraq and served 3 administrations on the National Security Council. Currently, John is jointly appointed as a distinguished professor of practice in the Nunn School, as well as the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy, where he works also directly with GTRI and the Strategic Energy Institute. So before turning to the fireside chat, it is also my distinct pleasure to introduce Angela Cabrera, who is the 12th president of Georgia Tech, to offer a few welcoming remarks. It is really our good fortune today to have our program kickstarted by President Cabrera, who is the architect of Georgia Tech's highly successful and unprecedented 10-year span of growth that has been guided by the principle of progress and service for all, and a mission for creating leaders who advance technology and improve the human condition. So please join me in welcoming President Cabrera.
Thank you, Professor Stolberg. And just before I leave you to this absolutely wonderful panel, a sense of place to frame this, which hopefully would also be useful for our guest of honor. You are in the John Lewis Student Center, named after an amazing leader of the civil rights movement and our local representative, U.S. representative for a number of years. And you will see a floor below us, a photo of John Lewis, the activist during the civil rights when he was a student leader. So it's a great form of inspiration for our students as they grow themselves into the leaders that I know they will become. You're also in the Walt Amer Room, which was named after a dear friend of ours, a different kind of leader, a business leader, the head of the finest restaurant, one of the finest restaurants anywhere, the Waffle House, and it was his desire before he passed away, and I offer him, we want to recognize you. You've been such an amazing leader and servant leader, and this is the space that he chose, and it's a space that over the years has been already the stage for amazing conversations on leadership. So just to give you a sense of space, this is a special location, and we are up for an incredible treat. One secret piece of information about our guest of honor, General McChrystal, although he insists that we call him Stan. I don't know that I'll get used to that. but is that he went to West Point with our Chief of Staff, General Ron Johnson, who is here with us today. And I know both of them as college classmates will have um, ammunition on each other. So I'm going to see if before Stan leaves Georgia Tech, I'm going to get some of that information. But the other great piece about today's conversation is that the person interviewing General McChrystal is also a West Point graduate, not of the fine class of '76, is from a not such a great class apparently, but he would deny it. And it is really very special because West Point has been, in a way, the ultimate school of leadership in this country, and in a way, a model for what we're trying to do at Georgia Tech. When we did our mission statement, we didn't say we're going to educate engineers or architects or accountants. We do all that stuff. We do it very well, but we said we're going to develop leaders who advance technology and improve the human condition. And this lecture is in that context of our effort to develop leaders who can make a real difference. And it couldn't be more appropriate to have here the author of the book on character. And in a way, it was a relief to read that part of the core idea of this book is that character is not an innate trait that you either have it or not when you're born. Is something you have to work every day on. In other words, there is room, there is a need, there's an opportunity for places like Georgia Tech to have that commitment in helping our students grow as leaders. Last thing I'll tell you is that last week we announced the creation of an institute at Georgia Tech, an institute for technology and civic leadership that is going to be entirely dedicated to this mission. So without any further ado, I leave you with an amazing panel, John Tien and Stan McChrystal.
Test.
Yep, good to go.
All right. So thanks very much, Adam Stolberg and President Cabrera for those wonderful introductions. I liked how, obviously I like the whole West Point connection type of thing. President Cabrera did a pretty good job of only slightly dissing my class of 1987. In fact, if you notice, he actually didn't say my class, he said 87. But we've got Ron Johnson, we've got Stan McChrystal here, West Point class of 76. One thing that President Cabrera did mention was, and he referenced the term servant leadership. The very first time that I met Stan McChrystal, was over video. I was a colonel on the National Security Council staff working for then President Barack Obama as his senior director for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Stan had just come in as the new, as you heard Adam Stolberg say, as the new ISAF commander, commanding, I think, about 150,000 troops in, spanning most of the NATO countries, 46 countries, I think, in total. And, your book, this great book, which I've read cover to cover several times now, on character, choices that define a life. I love that sort of tagline, choices that define a life, Stan. Can you tell us about your experiences in that year plus in command in ISAF, in Afghanistan? What choice are you most proud of or that you want to talk about as it relates to character? And then perhaps a choice that you wish you had maybe a do-over on. So 1 plus, maybe 1 negative. Stan?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for everybody taking the time to come. I took command in Afghanistan in June of 2009. For those of you who can do the math, we had been there 8 years at that point. We had gone there soon after 9/11, and for 8 years, the Afghans had watched the United States and other allies try to help them move forward. By June of 2009, there was a sense of resignation, a sense of frustration that was occurring at that point. And that's because they had expectations after 2001 that they would be able to, of course, overthrow the Taliban regime, but then there would be development, economic development, improved security, all the things that the people of Afghanistan had not had for almost 20 years or 30 years at that point, because there had been the fight against the Soviets and there had been an internal civil war. So they were just hoping that this would be a chance to move forward. And a couple of things occurred. One, as the United States and our allies went in, we didn't really invest very much. And we struggled a bit to help them develop an effective government. And of course, society had been in tatters, so it was a tall order. But then we had also been distracted by Iraq. And so the effort in Afghanistan had been on the back burner. So when I got there in June of 2009, there was a sense in the leadership of Afghanistan, a weariness. I went to see President Karzai, and he reminded me that I was the 10th ISAF commander in 8 years. And so he's sort of thinking, okay, here's the next person in this turnstile. The Afghan people understood the gap between what they had hoped for, maybe it was unrealistic, and what they were actually seeing, and they were frustrated. The Taliban had been resurgent. The neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan particularly, were not very helpful, and they all thought that the United States was losing heart, losing interest, and was going to pull out. So my goal when I took command was not just to do the military things, because in reality, that wasn't going to be enough. The problem in Afghanistan was not a military problem. It was a lack of confidence. It was a lack of confidence on the part of the Afghan people that they could do it and that we would be their partner. It was a lack of confidence by the Taliban that we could stop them. It was a lack of confidence on the part of Pakistan that we were going to stay the course. So they were constantly hedging their bets. So one of the things that I am most proud of or happy about the decision, I focused and we focused our efforts to connect to the Afghan people, to convince them that our mission was to protect them in a security sense, but then help them build a society. Of course, we know how it ended, and so it was not successful. But I'm convinced that it was the right thing to do. We changed the rules of engagement, so we used less firepower. It became less about killing insurgents on the battlefield than giving villages and valleys a chance to develop their own ecosystem that could survive. But it was a tough slog, because there were an awful lot of people, particularly back here in the United States, who were sending cards and letters or writing op-eds saying that we're not being tough enough. We haven't taken the gloves off to defeat the enemy, and that's our problem. And if we pull our punches, what's going to happen is we're just going to get a bad outcome. But we didn't change that direction. And I am really proud, because I still believe that was the right direction. Now, what am I least happy about? Well, there's a whole ton of them. We could be here for hours. But one of them is really related to that. And that is when we made the decision to try to change the strategy in Afghanistan, to build the confidence of the people. To a degree, you start to hope that your strategy works. And the famous quote is, hope is not a strategy. The reality is, we tried to do things in Afghanistan that the state of their population, the state of the technocrats in the government, really the lack of technocrats, and the weakness of other institutions made our mission incredibly difficult, arguably impossible. I don't think it was impossible, but when I have the hardest times when I soul search, I wonder whether I believed because I wanted to believe, or because I had done a careful calculation and it was accurate. You'll never know. I'll never know. But that's what bothers me.
Appreciate that, Stan. I mean, one of the things that we often said at the White House, and sometimes Stan would tell us over the secure video teleconference, usually from Kabul, was, words matter, missions matter, goals matter. And that's really around, many of the ways that your team analyzed. You said, what's the mission? And that's what we at the White House really owed you, and really from the policymakers, President Obama, Secretary Gates, Secretary Clinton, to say, are we trying to defeat the Taliban? Or are we simply trying to disrupt al-Qaeda, which is probably sounds similar, but this is the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. So students out there know, and you often hear me say it in class, words matter, admissions matter. This next question is going to end up with the 75th Ranger Regiment and your experience there. But one of the things I loved about Stan's book, number one, it's the shortest book that he has. I've read them all. My Share of the Task, Team of Teams, Risk, Leaders. They're great books. They're like 3 times the size. So I thought, okay, this one I'll get through a little bit quicker. But I wondered how you were going to weave in some of these things. And I loved how, sometimes you were talking about your corporate boards, and sometimes you were talking about things like the 75th Ranger Regiment. The way Stan has set this book up, it's really 3 sections: convictions, discipline, and character. And in your character section, you quote, actually, we've talked about West Point a couple times already. I think, again, great that somehow we got the words West Point into President Cabrera's mouth. I love that. Let's see if we can get him to quote the West Point prayer, which you quote in the book. Make us to choose the harder right instead of the easier wrong, and never be content with the half truth. Now, I'll let you unpack that, but when did you see in your time as the 75th Ranger Regiment commander, when you saw your Rangers choose the harder right over the easier wrong?
Yeah, I'm going to do the old trick with media and answer the question I wish you'd asked.
Got it.
I think we've got to go back. I think we've got to decide what character is. And I think we need to talk about that. I think we as a nation need to talk about that, because I don't think we're in agreement on what character is. I think character is the essence of who we are. It is the core of us. It is the most important thing. Heraclitus said, character is our fate. The famous pamphleteer Tom Paine said, reputation is what men know of us or think of us. Reputation is what gods and angels know of us. And the reality is, character is not what we say, it's what we do. It's not what we advertise, it is our behaviors, our actions. And so at the end of the day, it's the most important definition of us, the most important metric. Now, I don't think character is all the same in everybody, but I think it needs to be based upon a series of convictions that you have, the deeply held beliefs that you have pressure tested through time, the ones you're prepared to live to or die for. But it's also the product of the discipline we have to actually live to that. Because it's easy to have a lot of really impressive convictions, but if you don't actually live to them, they're nothing. Because anything times 0 is 0. If you talk to your children about the importance of integrity, and then that night at the kitchen table, you cheat on your taxes, you've defined or reflected your actual character. And all of us go through periods in our lives when we see disappointing character in people we don't like, and we sort of take a little bit of guilty pleasure in it. Then we see character failures or flaws in people we care deeply about. That's bothersome. And then we see our own failures, the times when we know what's right and that's not what we do. And those are the times when I think we need to go back to the centrality of character, because the reality is we know we're not going to leave with our wealth. We're not going to leave with any titles we have. We're not going to leave with anything from this world except what we've been to other people and to society. I mean, that's going to define us. And I think in the moment when we do finally leave the stage, if we feel guilty about not having been as good as we could have been, it could be a cause for regret. Now, to be sure, all of us are going to fail. I fail every day. I'm 71, and my character still disappoints me. but I think about it all the time now. When I was younger, I didn't think about it all the time. I just sort of took character for granted. And so now I think it's important that each of us thinks about it. We look inside and say, what is our character really? And then we look at each other and see if we can and should hold each other to account.
Much better answer to my less than good question. At some point, though, and if again, what part of this idea, this isn't about selling books. I did offer to Stan and the team. I said, we can create this book signing thing. And he said, and Stan said to me a few months ago, he says, John, this is not about selling books. This is about having a national conversation on character. Obviously, not only an advocate, but a representative of character. I'll give it another shot. This one, I have a feeling, just because I've read so many of your books and I've been with you in this place as well, this is a Gettysburg question, right? So, Stan in his book and in his books, he talks about when he went to go teach a leadership course as a fellow at the Jackson School of Global Affairs at Yale University. You somehow got connected to the Yale football coach, and eventually it led to him saying, can you talk to my team about leadership? It's not about winning. This is about leadership. And you decided that you would do effectively a staff ride. Now, Stan is the former JSOC commander, the former regiment commander. And so you said, instead of walking around with clipboards and looking at maps and stuff, Stan took them on a run around, and you do this almost every year. Interestingly, about 6-7 years ago, one of the things that Stan and I share a passion for is national service. And so I went to a national service conference. Stan was at the Service Year Alliance. Stan was obviously not only the chairman of the board, the leader of it, keynote speaker, but he said, optional for anybody in the audience, tomorrow morning at 5:30, we're going to go for a run around Gettysburg. And of course, every ex-military and wannabe folks showed up and said, look, the guy's, he's whatever you were then. You're 55, 60 years old, and probably older than that. And we're like, we can outrun him. And I was like dying, of breath, even though I'm a good 15 years younger than you. And thank goodness, at some point, we got to a monument. You told us, pausing. We're like, thank God he's pausing, right? And he said, now everybody take a knee. He said, thank God we're taking a knee. Then you talk to us. Why has Gettysburg been such a touchstone for you? And what can we learn about character from the battles of Gettysburg, whether it's on the South or in the North?
Yeah, thanks for asking, John. I first went to Gettysburg in 1966. My father had just come back from Vietnam, and he had to go up and coordinate the burial of my uncle, his brother-in-law, who had died at a relatively young age in the National Cemetery. So he took me up there with him to do the coordination, and while there, we went around the battlefield. Remember, that is just after the centennial. I was 12 years old at the time. I'd been very interested in the centennial, and so had the opportunity to see this battlefield. If you go to Gettysburg, there's some interesting things about it. First, it is a pretty well-preserved battlefield. It's one of the few battlefields in America that immediately after the event itself, people understood the importance of it. And fairly soon, there were efforts made to make that ground special. A national cemetery was established, and of course, President Lincoln went up and gave the famous Gettysburg Address in November, just a few months after the July battle. And then over the years, the battlefield started to be developed. The North put a number of monuments on the battlefield. The Confederates were not allowed to do that. The North put monuments on the battlefield. And it's very interesting when you look at them, because you look at this monument and you'd think it'd be like one of Saddam Hussein's victory statues, but they're not. Most of them are fairly plain marble obelisks, and it typically lists the unit, the number of casualties that they had, often the year they were mustered into service and when they left. It didn't say we kicked their butts. What it said, or what it communicates, is when the nation asked us to serve, to do our duty, we were here. And I thought that was extraordinarily important. As we got into the early 19th century or 20th century, they started to allow the South to do the same thing. And they put a number of monuments on the battlefield. So both sides are represented. If you look at the battlefield as a soldier, you look at the terrain and it speaks to you because the terrain's pretty clear. You can see the 3 days of the battlefield and they all make great sense from a military standpoint. When you look from a deeper sense, these were two armies that were 2.5 years into the Civil War. The dilettantes were gone. They understood how difficult this war already was. The Army of the Potomac, the North, had struggled and lost repeatedly to General Robert E. Lee. But General Lee and the Confederates also knew that strategically they had weaknesses of supply and manpower and all these other things, that it was a high-risk endeavor to go up into the North, into Pennsylvania, and to take on the Army of the Potomac with the hopes that you get a knockout punch. So both sides come to the battle knowing this is hugely important. And during the battle, over 50,000 Americans are either killed or wounded. I mean, think about that. Every building in the town of Gettysburg of any size was used as a hospital. The armies fought this cataclysmic fight. The North won, the South had to pull back, and it became part of American history or American lore, the largest cannonade ever fired on the North American continent to this day was the Battle of Gettysburg, the third day. Now, the thing about the battlefield is, on one hand, it's almost seductive because there's depictions of heroism, obvious sacrifice, all of the things that are entrancing about war. And then you step back and you say, for 3 days, combined armies of almost 170,000 men tried to rip each other to pieces, tried to destroy the others, all Americans until that day. And so it is simultaneously a location, from my standpoint, that can be inspiring, but it's also a cautionary tale, because these were people that decades before would never have dreamed of this. It was only 87 years after the signing of the Constitution. And here we were trying to destroy the nation. And to me, it's to pay attention the importance and the fragility of our nation. As a final point, it can be used for leadership. And so I've taken group after group up there, particularly the Yale football team. And the coach created a leadership development program about 12 years ago. And I've been working with him ever since. And he didn't focus on obviously teaching Yale football players the tactics of the battle, but just on focused character. What really made teams and what made the kind of leaders who could do amazing things. About a year ago, that same coach, extraordinary guy, close friend, had health problems, and he couldn't coach last year. Without a head coach, the team went on and won the Ivy League championship because of what he'd been creating. So when we think about the value of what you're doing here at Georgia Tech, the importance of the focus on character, and it stands out to you both in places as monumental in Gettysburg and as seemingly mundane as a football team.
You know, Stan, you talked about obviously North and South and Civil War, and it was a brother on brother, American on American, West Pointer on West Pointer. I think the famous statistic for West Point is, or for the Civil War, is 98% or 99% of the battles were led by generals who graduated from West Point, both on the North and the South side. One of the quotes you talked about in your book, it said, "It would be good to start by listening to and respecting opposing groups, but we should probably settle for not demonizing the opposition." Now, clearly, we were demonizing the opposition on both sides, probably South and North. But I'd like to take it forward to, not the 1860s, but 2026. Our country feels like we're ever dividing at this point in time. We've seen an increase in political violence, to include the attempted near assassination of President Trump, and judges, Democrats, Republicans, Charlie Kirk. How do we take the temperature down on political violence in this nation?
Yeah, I think the first is to understand that that tendency to first distrust and then dislike people who aren't you is natural. And it's gone back in history. You tend to be very curious, but also cautionary about people who have a different language, different religion, different background than you do. And sometimes what happens is media or just popular discussion starts to demonize that enemy. They start to say that particular religion or that group, they are evil or whatever. Very rarely does that come from up close interaction. It tends to be from things that are at least at arm's length. Sometimes during wartime, it makes sense. There's a famous billboard that Admiral Halsey put up in the South Pacific, entrance to one of the harbors, and it said, "Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs." Now, right now, that seems a little extreme, but in the context of the moment, it was not really acceptable. It was almost expected, because we get into war and suddenly it's hard to kill people you know and care for. It's easy to kill the enemy, and that's why we give them names. Dinks, Hun, you name it. We dehumanize them to make it easier to kill them. And of course, both sides do it. It's understandable cleanly in war, but when we talk about in a political environment, we have an era right now where I think it's fueled by the power of information technology. It's so much easier to propagate messages out. The cost is almost zero. You go back 30 years, they had to print leaflets and get them out, and there was the limit to the ability to influence just by your reach. Nowadays, that's not limited. And the more extreme your message, the more likely it is to resonate with people, the more entertaining it is. Every once in a while, you talk about a political issue, and I'll be asked, what do I think about Iran or whatever? And if I stood on the stage and I said, we need to crush them, a certain percentage of that audience is likely to cheer and really like that message. But if I say, it's a really complicated issue, let's talk about it, that's less energizing. It's less clear. It's less decisive. And so I think what happens is our media and our own tendencies tend to generate this more. And of course, it generates political support. It generates contributions and whatnot. Yet if we really were in the same room with the other people, often we'd find there's really much less difference than we thought there would. At West Point, when I was there, we used to make people who didn't like each other room together. And it is interesting because invariably they became buds. And I don't know if we could do that on a national scale, but I'd certainly be open to try. Force people together, I just think it would make sense.
Again, this is sort of the general is obviously skilled in fireside chats, and I have this great script. I'm a good West Pointer and everything, and I'm moving totally off script here. One of the things I heard you and I spoke about a little bit earlier today at a different conference or a different talk was how you modify the rules of engagement in Afghanistan. I'm actually going to take it back to a little bit to Iraq when you were the JSOC commander and I was the Task Force 237 Armored Commander in Ramadi. And you certainly know the battle for Ramadi well. First SEAL who was killed there, Mark Lee, and then Michael Mansour also killed in action, Medal of Honor recipient, Navy SEAL. So tough fight. But when we went down there, Sean McFarland, who I know you know well, said, look, this is really still, it feels very kinetic. It feels very us on al-Qaeda and us on the Sunni triangle and us on the Sunnis. But remember, we're here to try to hand this country back over to the people of Iraq. And that includes, while it's the majority of Shia, but a minority of Sunnis who love this country. And that's very much how we did it. As you reflect on how you've been able to modify things, whether it was the ROE in Afghanistan, how did you take the temperature down? How did you step away from the dehumanizing of, quite honestly, al-Qaeda, Iranians who were, bombing us with IEDs, with EFPs and things of that nature? Were there any ways that you tried to do that in the hardest place possible, which would be combat?
Yeah, and first to understand the dynamic that occurs, and that is that political leaders may start wars for political reasons, but they're a little like fires. And once they start to burn, they burn for other reasons. And on the battlefield where soldiers are, they burn because you lost your comrade, or you saw things that the enemy had done, or you're steeling yourself to be able to kill. I led the counterterrorist forces in Iraq from 2003 to 2008. When we first started, there was this idea, okay, we're going to go out and decapitate the leadership of that and solve that problem. And that turned out to be an impossible strategy to execute. So we shifted that strategy and we said, we are going to try to target every mid-level leader in al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was a lot. When I took over, we were doing 4 raids a month or 1 a week. By 2 years later, we were doing 300 a month, at least 10 every night. And these were kinetic operations. I'm not talking patrols, I'm talking about kicking the door open and somebody's likely to get killed. The level of violence started to reach this point where we're almost like boxers in the ring. And what that means is you're at the 12th round, you've sort of been punched so hard, but you are not going to give up. You are going to go after that person. My force absolutely felt it because it was a very professional counterterrorist force, and most of them had been in the fight that entire period. And so there's a tendency to just want to do whatever I can to win. And that goes all the way up to the highest levels. The problem is, unless you have a complete, total war, like maybe World War II or the Civil War, where you are going to crush your foe, that's really not the path to victory. The path to success, however you define victory, almost always involves military action, but then negotiation and agreement to end it. Because unless you're going to kill them all, at some point you are going to negotiate with people and get some kind of modus vivendi after that. So what we had to do is we had to start to take our operations, and we had to start to contextualize them more. In the case of Ramadi and other places, we started to shape what we did and didn't do so that we were more thoughtful about those things that we did, where we used firepower, where we used all kinds of our force, so that it created an outcome as opposed to simply being the boxer in the ring. Later, when I commanded in Afghanistan, and we touched on a little bit earlier, that was even more true. And so as we think about military strategy, sometimes people say there are diplomats and you negotiate or conduct diplomacy, and then once it goes to war, you turn it over to the soldiers, and then the soldiers end it, and then it goes back to diplomacy. That's not my view at all. They have to overlap the entire period. Diplomacy has to continue because that's the point of it. War is an extension of politics by other means, and to politics it must return.
Nice, nice. The On Character book, obviously, I wouldn't say you're plagiarizing necessarily because we are a fireside chat. I want you to stay for the rest of the thing, but it's really from Clausewitz, right, on war, right? And you see this on leadership and other things. But I mean, it's so central to what you're speaking about. You are a world famous reader. In fact, we were just talking about you're reading a set of a biography essentially right now. According to your book, and I think as you talked about My Share of the Task, your autobiography, your memoir, you say that your love of reading really came from your mother, who is honored and buried alongside your father at Arlington National Cemetery. You quote philosophers. You've already talked about Thomas Paine in the book, Aristotle, Socrates, authors like C.S. Lewis and Antoine Meyer, who wrote Once an Eagle. Where does your love of reading comes from your mother? Why do you continue to read now? And remember, this is a good majority of our audience, and certainly those who will see this on the Sam Nunn School YouTube channel, are Gen Z, are students. Why should we keep reading?
Yeah, convince me, I'll stop. Yeah, how are you going to learn? If you think about the ways we learn from experience, the things we see and do, the people we listen to. But there's a pretty finite limit to that. You're just not going to have the time and reach to do as many things in life as you need to learn about. So reading is the way to vicariously experience the things that people have done. If you read thoughtfully, people who have thought a lot about issues and really examined them, they've written some pretty good stuff. And then if you look at lives, biographies, I tend to read all nonfiction. And the reason is I like the idea of learning something that actually occurred. I don't really read for entertainment, although I find it pleasurable and entertaining. I read because I really want to learn about whatever it is I'm reading, about that person or wherever. So I think the idea of reading is something that you can't stop. As soon as you stop, I think you stop thinking. And there's a great danger to stop thinking because you suddenly subcontract it out to other people.
I like that, self-contract out or going to the third party. I mentioned your mother. Somewhere in the audience is your lifelong partner, Annie, your wife and spouse. In the book, you talk about your 3 granddaughters. You talk about, there is a chapter. So there's a chapter on the 75th Ranger Regiment, effectively, and there's a chapter on how to lead a successful marriage. You've already had a couple moments here where you've shown yourself to be a person of deep reflection, of vulnerability. And in this world that we live in today, that kind of vulnerability is largely seen as a weakness. I mean, for us as combat hardened soldiers, we should be, extolling masculine virtues constantly. And we certainly had to do it on the battlefield. How does being vulnerable in this moment help us be better leaders of character?
I think it's being honest. If you think about it, many of us create a facade or a persona that we think people expect from us. If you're a business leader or a military leader, you've got to look and act a certain way. And we start to take on those behaviors. Some of them are good, but some of them are not real. My father talked about right at the end of World War II, he was over in Europe, and there were a bunch of leaders who would walk around with the equivalent of pearl handle pistols, like George Patton had done, and they would be profane, and they were trying to mimic a person, but it wasn't them. It was General Patton, and he could be that. Nobody else can be that person. So I think the thing about honesty is, unless you are extraordinarily confident, you have self-doubts, you have vulnerabilities, you have weaknesses. You've got them. You're really not fooling anybody else by pretending you don't have them. So I find it not uncomfortable at all to admit the ones that I think I have. And I probably have others that I haven't even seen. But the reality is, I think if we're honest enough to ourselves and to other people, we're going to get an allowance for that. They're going to give us the grace to be who we really are, particularly if we're always trying to be better.
Do you have any examples of where you were honest with your soldiers, whether it was in the 75th Ranger Regiment, the 82nd? Do you find a time where it really worked well for you to be honest?
Yeah, there are a number of times when you make decisions that don't come out right. And when they don't come out right, you've got to admit it. There was a case, and there's a British officer here from the 22 SAS, the British Special Forces, and we served together overseas. And there was an operation where his organization was working essentially under our control, and they flew into an area, and they went after an Egyptian bomb maker in a building. And they took a lot of fire. Excuse me, the first they did an operation, not for the bomb maker, they took a lot of fire. They called in an AC-130 gunship and destroyed the building. And immediately after, the next day, there were accusations of civilians being killed in the building. And so I implemented what we call a 15-6 investigation. And that's an investigation to look at any time there was an accusation of civilian casualties. I don't say it was pro forma. They were serious investigations, but they were automatic. Well, I implemented one on that action. 3 or so weeks later, same organization doing an operation against an Egyptian bomb maker. Land helicopters take heavy fire from this building, and I'm watching it in real time from a Predator full motion video downlinked. And I say, okay, they're taking fire. They're going to destroy the building. That is the right thing to do. Instead, they went head on to try to take it. And I watched them as they pulled 4 operators away. I didn't know if they were dead or wounded at that point. And I was beside myself. I said, what are they doing? They eventually went in again and did it and were able to capture the building. But I realized later what had happened, and it was my fault. Because the American forces that I commanded knew that when there was an action like that, it automatically triggered a 15-6. I'd never told that force. And so they draw a conclusion that says General Stan doesn't want us to use AC-130s, or General Stan doesn't trust us. They're trying to do what I want, but I didn't communicate effectively how we do that. And so when something like that happens, you start by admitting it to yourself, because it's easy to find a way to rationalize away from it. Then you got to admit it to other people. Now, you don't have to go out, bare your chest and start crying. You don't have to get in a fetal position in the corner, because everybody makes mistakes. But you just said, okay, I got this one wrong, and I won't get it wrong next time.
And then honesty flows downward throughout with and openness, a culture within the organization. That was similar, a little bit different, but in Ramadi, you had, as you might recall, this is on the conventional side, a rules of engagement, the authorization of a main gun round. That was a tanker, so an M1A1 Abrams tanker. The authorization main gun round really came from the battalion commander. So, and we had a situation, we were taking heavy fire. We're pretty sure they had IED clackers effectively. And so I authorized the use of a main gun round. Took out the building, took out the insurgents. They stopped firing us because we killed them effectively. The next morning, we heard that there was civilians in the basement. Now, they weren't using them as human shields as we didn't know it. We probably would not have engaged. We wouldn't have engaged in that way. So I went with my lawyer, my JAG lawyer, the next day for reparations and things of that nature. And I remember the village leader, who was probably, at minimum, an AQ supporter, definitely a Sunni, because it was Ramadi, and said, and so we offered, it was less about money, because I really don't want your money, but I do appreciate your honesty. And, really, this is counterinsurgency, winning hearts and minds. And so it starts to flow. You don't know when it's necessarily going to flow in that direction, but it does. A connected item, and, we're 35, almost 40 minutes into this, and I want to make sure I get to stay on as a podcaster in the world. So, somehow I've yet to say artificial intelligence. So I'm going to say artificial intelligence now. I'm going to bring it into the conversation. How has he gotten this far into this? You have a great quote in your book, and you say that trust is the intersection of faith and responsibility. In society today, we tend to struggle with trust. Many public figures lie regularly, and we've reached a bizarre agreement to neither believe what they say nor hold them accountable. Now, AI is only making this worse. I mean, we've moved well past misinformation, and we're fully into disinformation. What can we Americans, and answer out of the AI question you want, Stan, but my question is, what responsibility do we have as Americans to, as we develop as leaders of character, to be better about the state of trust, responsibility, and information in today's world of AI?
Yeah, I'm going to start just on trust and then go to AI. We have to hold each other to account. You know, right now, if somebody gets up and they get on TV and they look at us and they lie, we don't hold them to account. We give them our votes, we give them our contributions, we give them our social media likes, because we have that strange arrangement where we expect them to lie because they are a politician or maybe a corporate leader, and we just look at it, but there has started to be this acceptance of that. Of course, that's a slippery slope, because as soon as we accept it and everyone else will accept it in ourselves. And so the fact that trust has to be based on experience. And what that means is, if I asked everyone in this audience who you trust, you'd probably say your spouse, your parents, your pastor, somebody like that. And I'd say you trust McDonald's. And you'd go, well, I don't care for that food. Doesn't matter. They've used decades to tell you, to convince you that when you see the sign, you know what the product is, you know what the price is, you know what the experience is, and you can make a decision on whether you want to eat there. And the key thing about trust is understanding that relationship. Can somebody do what they say they'll do, and will they do it? As I say often, there are people in this world that I love dearly that I wouldn't trust with anything. There are other people that I can't stand that I have and would trust my life again to. Because it's not about affection. It's about a confidence that someone will do what they advertise that they will do. Now, let's just get to AI. It's sort of multifaceted here. On the one hand, AI has given us the ability to create deep fakes. And so suddenly we start to look at documents and we say, I don't know if that was written by that person. It could have been written by the machine. We see really realistic videos of people doing things or still photos that they had nothing to do with. And so we've started to have this doubt about what we see or read, its veracity. On the other hand, I think there's great potential in the future. So, for example, if you take things like the Congressional Budget Office, if we could continue to develop AI so that we could take as many economic factors, the metrics and data that we know, put them in there and get a pretty high confidence prediction of what's going on in the economy and what's likely to happen. You could start with a single understanding of truth, and then you could make policies from that. Our problem now is we have policy differences, but they're also often based on completely different interpretations of what's true and what isn't true. And each policy recommendation may make great sense if you base it on that interpretation of facts. So if we can close the gap, and maybe AI could help us do that, because it could bring so much data in, it could crunch that in a way that we just can't do in real time as human beings, and we could put it out there. Now, there's a way for it to go. And of course, there's all kinds of cautionary things that we'd have to build into that. But I think perhaps we could move forward.
I mean, one of the cautionary things that you and I were speaking about AI earlier today, Stan, was the responsibility of those, not necessarily who are programming it, but who are using it. And of course, in the Department of Defense, Department of War, as it's now known, it's very much human in the loop. But we're moving very quickly to where the race to be the most effective will take the human out of the loop. And then I think we're going to have to back up as Americans, but as citizens of the world, to think, what is my responsibility here? And as you said, cautionary tale. You have all these great quotes throughout your book. Again, I'm trying to encourage people not only have this character conversation today, but take a look and read your book. You have when I came across this quote, I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of where we're at, unfortunately. You say that America today is less of the land of opportunity and more the land of opportunism. That sounds pretty negative. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't apply to everyone. But if you think about it, the land of opportunity, to me, was always based on the idea that if you were willing to pursue something, work hard, you had the chance of attaining that, whether it was a certain amount of economic security, things for your family, you name it. The American dream was real, but it was based on what you did. When I talk about opportunism now, I think what we've got is an increasing culture that if you have the opportunity to get something, you will be a sucker if you don't do that. If you don't cut the line, if you don't get a special opportunity, if you are in a position of power, if you don't leverage that in ways to your personal benefit. Again, not everybody does it, but we see way more of it than we should, and we accept it. This is the disturbing part. As long as we accept it, think of the generations, the younger people that come up and they watch that and they go, well, that's the way the game's played, so I'm going to play that game. It's only played that way because we let it be played that way. We have agency. The thing about character is we own it. We could change the character in ourselves or in our society tomorrow if we just decided to. Wouldn't be simple. We absolutely could. Nobody else controls it. And so the beauty is we have the opportunity.
It's again, you remember the book is split up into convictions to split in character. And what you just said, character, we own it. It's ours. This is a funny aside, is one of the things that in your book you talk about is the general's, he's a famous reader, he's a philosopher, he's the best warrior we've ever had, according to Secretary Gates. But you're also a famous night eater, right? You don't eat. I've been with Stan for about 8 hours so far. I haven't seen you take in 1 calorie. So it's pretty impressive. And I thought this was like some kind of, like, I was conventional forces, so, we're tankers, we eat a lot. And give us an MRE, we'll ask for 2, even though they're awful. But I always thought it was some sort of like JSOC, special forces thing. But in your book, you say, I'm not asking you a question, I'm just making a funny aside, is you say that one of the reasons you only eat 1 meal a day is because you own that. Not because you're trying to be more fit or whatever, but or you're too cheap to buy new pants or something of that nature. Maybe Annie would say that's true. So that was just the funny aside. When you said you own character, it is about discipline. This next question is about taking a stand. You, in your book, you say one's resulting silence is deafening, and we leave the stage and field to the ideologue and the opportunist. You're just talking about opportunism. It really, as soon as I read that quote, it reminded me, of course, we're in Atlanta, we're in the Emmer Theater in the John Lewis Student Center, someone you knew well, who you dedicated your leader's book to. This is the home of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Remind me of his quote, "There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must take it because conscience tells him it is right." This is, again, we're talking to the Gen Zers, the Georgia Tech students, the lieutenants, the captains, whoever are in Gen Z these days. Our organizations today are telling us more and more to stay quiet. Don't take that stand. I mean, how do we, we can't, like, I want to run out of here and take every stand that I can, but I mean, is it prudent to do so? How do you think we should approach this for the Gen Zers in the audience?
Well, with deep thought and seriousness, because you're going to live with what you do or you don't do. If you go back to Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, those of you who are familiar with that know that it was in response to a number of white pastors who had written him a letter and said, yeah, we are in sympathy with the movement, but you're pushing too hard. You need to go more slowly. And his brilliant response says, we have been 300 years. How can we possibly be told simple equality, we should go more slowly? And yet the white pastors were well-intentioned. What they were trying to do was say, we agree, but let's be careful about it. And this gets to taking a side. And this is really, really hard. If you lead a corporation now, or even if you have a significant role in a school, in something, if you take a position on many issues, you'll be dogpiled on social media. You'll also often have different forces that come after you. And there's this natural aversion to being the target of that. Thanks. None of us really like to be targeted like that. On the other, and there's also a hesitation that you'll hurt your institution that you're a part of. You will hurt shareholder value. You will hurt some other part of it. And so there's this tendency to say, well, I won't speak up. I won't take a stand. I will be careful. I will be apolitical. I'm not sure if there's a right or wrong here because I struggle with this. But the reality is if too many people, leaders, don't take a stand, if too many leaders don't push our system, then our system will essentially be controlled by a small number of very active, extreme people on both ends of the spectrum. And I don't think that that's helpful. And so we put people of influence, probably most of the people in this room, in that very uncomfortable position of what are we going to do when you really got to stand up and be counted, or you're asked to stand up and be counted.
So two more questions, Stan. The last one really will be, however you want to close out our session. But this next last question is really referencing actually not the book, but you're a prolific reader, but you're also a prolific writer, New York Times bestselling books and things of that nature. But you're all, and by the way, you Google Stan. I had plenty of folks who came before me. I don't think I'm giving Jon Stewart quite the run on the Daily Show for being funny, but you are, it's amazing how much you are taking a stand. You're saying your words, and you're helping us lead a national conversation on character. But you're also right, and you wrote a guest essay for the New York Times about a year ago. It was almost a year ago. It was April, I think. In fact, it was entitled "Be Not Afraid." It's a great piece. It's about, 2 pages, not particularly long. But one of the things you said was, too many have abandoned the basic principles of integrity, decency, and respect. Without these, society does not simply fray, it collapses. This is your opportunity to call us to service, to call us to action. You've done a lot of exemplar speaking, so it's like, well, we're going to be like Stan McChrystal. But what would you charge the Gen Zs, the students, the lieutenants, the captains, and others to do? Is it one of our passion projects, which is national service? Over to you, Stan.
Yeah, I'll talk about 2 things. First is national service. I think many Americans have no opportunity to know Americans of a different religion, of a different zip code, of a different class of prosperity. There's just not interaction. If you go back to something like the Second World War, where 16 million Americans served, you put people from all over the country together and they are forced. And it's a good thing because you suddenly realize that people with a different accent than you, different background, are extraordinarily good people. They've just had a different life journey. But how do we replicate that? You don't want to start world wars so we can get people interacting. I think we do it with national service. And when I talk national service, I'm not talking about everybody goes in the military. I'm talking about everybody spends at least a year of their life serving other Americans. I like the idea of doing it when you're young, right after high school or right after college. You do a year in conservation, healthcare, caring for the elderly, teaching. Any number of things could use this infusion of young talent, but it really wouldn't be the payoff. The work done would not be the biggest benefit. It's what would happen to those people who had that experience. Because what happens is suddenly you deal with people at that level and you come away with a different mindset. You are more. You vote at 3 times the rate of people who don't because you're a shareholder in the nation. If you ever think about it, if you've ever had to pick up trash, you don't litter as much. And so the idea is give everybody something they've done that they also can be proud of. I love the idea that you get to the airport and they start to say, okay, people of this status get to go first. Then they say veterans or active duty service members can get on. What if they said all young people doing national service, you get on now? Because there are a lot of young people in America are never going to get that recognition. They're never going to have that sense, I did something good and I was recognized for it, because we just don't give them the opportunity for that. Why can't we create it? Why can't we have a time when a really ambitious young person wants to run for Congress and they get up on the stage and someone says, where'd you serve? And they go, and their campaign's over. Regardless of where they serve, the fact that they did it, I think should be something that makes everybody proud and feel like an important person, feel like a citizen. Now, when I first joined this movement more than a decade ago, I thought it should be mandatory, but I was told, no, mandatory is not popular. I'm now back to mandatory. I think certain things in life you never volunteer for, but you ought to do. Because there is, I tell people, there are a lot of things that people forced me to do when I was young that were good for me, that I wouldn't have opted in the moment. I think that could change how America thinks of itself. And I think it could take us in a completely different direction. What was the other part of that question?
Oh, it's called action. You answered it.
Yeah.
The last question, I'll ask it, but you can answer it however you want. It's really your parting words, Stan. But I've often talked to you over the course of the 15 years I've known you is, it's amazing. This is going to be great for your legacy. And you're like, John, I don't care about my legacy. But what I do know you care about, at least based on your book and some of the things you've even said today, is you care about what your granddaughters, Emmy Lou, Elsie, and Daisy, I believe are their names. I never met them, met their grandmother. What do you want them to think of Stan McChrystal after he sails off into fair winds and following seas?
Yeah, John, thanks for asking. When I say I don't care about my legacy, I'm lying. I do. Now, what I don't care about is whether in books or in statues or on marble, there's something to me. That's just not important to me. But the people who actually knew me, the people who actually know what I said and did, I hope they approve. I hope my 3 granddaughters, they're young, they know me now, but in the years ahead, they'll know what they see on YouTube, what they read in books, and they'll have to make a decision. Am I proud of what Granddaddy did? Or maybe am I embarrassed or disappointing what he did or didn't do? And it's extraordinarily important to me that they not feel the latter. They don't have to think I'm perfect, because I'm certainly not. But I think I want them to think that I tried to be good. I think that's all this we can do. We talk about a national conversation on leadership or a character. All I'm really talking about is we challenge ourselves. And then we show the courage to challenge each other. Challenge our society to be better than we'd be otherwise.
Thanks so much, Stan. Please read this book, and please welcome again and thank Stan McChrystal for this time.